Hello, I'm Pasta Jardula, and welcome to the Convo Couch. If you've been to Central America in the last decade, you might have visited one of its safest countries, Nicaragua. But since April, unrest and protests have plagued the country. Here to talk about the situation with us is Rachel Bruhnke. Rachel Bruhnke is an environmental engineer with a degree in political science and an emphasis on Latin American affairs. Rachel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great. Well, listen, why don't you unpack for our audience from the time of the Sandinistas revolution in Reagan up into 2006 when Daniel Ortega got reelected. Go ahead.
Okay, a small ordeal. I just want to say, first of all, I'm 50 years old. I was in high school at the time of the Reagan wars against Central America. And I say that because anyone listening here today, and it's something I was posting today on Facebook, it is incumbent upon all of us who were my age or older, who remember those days, who lived those days, to keep talking, keep remembering. So I so appreciate you, Pasta, for doing this show.
Thank you.
Well, we need to go back even further, right? And we need to go back to the takeover by an American, I forget his first name, but Walker in Nicaragua, who declared himself king, went down to Nicaragua, declared himself king, and the ruler of Nicaragua, and basically helped bring in the U.S. Marines in the 1920s. And there was a hero, Augusto Sandino, that tried to kick the U.S. Marines in the 1920s, almost 100 years ago, out of Nicaragua. And that's why in the 1980s, the movement was called the Sandinista, and today called the Sandinista movement. When Sandino was murdered in the 1920s, the U.S. installed a Somoza dynasty, the dynasty of the Somoza family that lasted almost 40 years. It ended when the Nicaraguan Revolution, but one of the precipitators of that was a very bad earthquake in the late 1970s. And the United States sends millions of dollars down to help the Nicaraguan people. When the Nicaraguans learned that this money had been taken by the Somoza dynasty and used for more corrupt purposes, that was the last straw, and that was the Nicaraguan Revolution. So, of course, in 1979, out goes Jimmy Carter and in comes Ronald Reagan. And you remember those days also, Pasta. We were told that Nicaraguans, communists, were going to be here in 4 days if we didn't stop them. And so what we did was we began what was called the Contra movement, the Contra, it means against, to overthrow the revolution, the very popular revolution in Nicaragua, which was helping to bring education to the people and healthcare and land to landless peasants. I mean, I know we're going to talk another day about Honduras, but I lived for 3 years in the Peace Corps. I was on the southern border of Honduras, on the border of Nicaragua. So I saw after the wars the effects of the Contra wars, because the Contras were all based in Honduras. And so we have mass graves in southern Honduras of people rising up and, et cetera, et cetera. So the Contra War killed about 50,000 Nicaraguans. That today would be about 2.5 million people in the United States. So people need to understand the devastation that we've caused around the world. And so in 1990, after 10 years of nonstop, relentless wars, please, people, you need to look up the Iran-Contra scandal. I think we need to start finding some YouTube videos and getting all that, Oliver North and Fawn Hall and all that nonsense.
I believe, Rachel, that was the time, though, when, America had a great scare as far as communism is concerned. You see the pictures of Daniel Ortega with Castro, and, that was shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, around that time. So there was a big scare back then, was there not?
Not by a lot of people. Like I said, I was a teenager at the time, but I remember my dad thinking the whole anti-communism in the United States was nonsense anyway. And he always told me, he said, Rachel, always remember, the word was not communism. The word was godless communism. So they terrified the American people. They, turned us to the religious right. And I mean, that's a whole other story. And I'd love to, in December, we did a a panel, an all-day panel in Los Angeles, and we called it the Cold War Truth Commission. And we did a lot of personal testimonies from Central America about what the United States did in the name of anti-communism and as satellite theaters for the Cold War to Central America.
Yeah.
So, fast forward it, to 1990, you asked me to bring it up to today, to 1990, Violeta Chamorro, after 10 years of brutal Contra war against Nicaragua, the people finally had enough, and they said, okay, we'll vote it out. And in came a right-winger, Violeta Chamorro, whose family had been in, right-wing government in Nicaragua forever. And from then until 2006, basically all the regular families, the oligarch families, have been in control, putting in the right-wing neoliberal agenda and impoverishing Nicaragua. And so when Ortega, by 2000, the right-wing government, poverty had been at an all-time high. There was no social security programs, gang graffiti everywhere, and several years later that people finally had the freedom to go back and re-vote in Daniel Ortega.
Yeah. Well, let me digress a little bit before the 1990s because we missed one part over there. Didn't Daniel Ortega also rule out of the Sandinistas government and kind of impose a socialistic mentality, which was good for the people? However, didn't superinflation sack the country and really kind of ruin it economically?
The U.S.-backed war ruined the country economically. I mean, we don't know. It's like saying I'm debating with someone on Facebook right now. Oh, Cuba, Havana's full of trash, and
okay,
and, blah blah blah. And it's like, well, who knows what would have happened if they didn't have to spend all their money defending their country.
I hear you.
Yeah, sure, yeah. There was super hyperinflation. You could say that today in Venezuela. But if people were left alone under international law to, follow their sovereign right to develop the way that they determine they should, then we don't know what the economy is.
It seems that no matter who's in office, whether it be a Democrat or a Republican, that the same kind of mentality, it's very kept quiet. We really don't know what's going on in South and Central America. Only people like yourselves really actually know what's going on. But we seem to keep this quietness about it and just go about our everyday business. Meanwhile, our CIA or our government is just turning the country upside down and is what is really the main cause of migration towards this country. Would you not agree?
Definitely. And I've been saying for a while, ever since kind of this uprising against Trump and, which we all need to take advantage of and really politicize, because people are anti-Trump, but they haven't really been in politics or listening at all for decades. But that it's very, very important to listen to Latin America and to talk about Latin America. That's why I appreciate what you're doing so much. For a couple of reasons. One is that it's easier to understand because so many people have been to Latin America. So many Americans know at least one country, or they eat Mexican food or whatever. They have some identification. So it's a little easier potentially for Americans to feel some sympathy, which in the end is what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to just get out of our fascist mentality and understand we're all equal on the planet and feel some sympathy. Yeah. The irony we were talking about yesterday, Pasta, is that from the Reagan days all the way to the Trump days today, it's red America that's voting. It's both parties, but my dad always used to say the worst thing about Democrats are Republicans. So, forced, and that's when, people, even liberals, got to strap on a pair and really start practicing some politics. But it's the kind of poor in this country, or the farmers, the rural people, who are voting to kill rural people in other countries. It absolutely doesn't make sense. Yeah. And so one reason is that we can find some understanding because we are close, so that's a possibility. Yeah. Secondly, is that there have been in the past 15 years, 60 years, including Cuba, but for the past 15 years, some incredible advances in progressive social programs and social dynamics and economic ideas and trading relationships that I think Americans, if they knew, would be quite excited about. And so, it's no accident it's been silently been crushed because you can't know the example of what's been happening throughout South and Central America for the 15 years.
I think it's just kind of it's ironic that a lot of Trump supporters, and I don't want to say all of them, but I want to say a lot of them, always complain about migration. They always immigration, I should say, and they complain. They said they wanted a wall, whatnot. Let's keep people out, whatnot. Yet they don't want to go to the root of the problem. And I constantly tell them, well, the root of the problem is our intervention in America, from America. If we would stop intervening in their government, if we would stop enforcing coups and changing the political landscape over there, they wouldn't come here as much because they wouldn't need to. But let me digress. Let's get that back to 2006.
Can I say it's really important what
Go right ahead.
And because I think it's very important we learn how to talk to that base here in America. And another maybe idea that I'm thinking of right now is, red state America has had to migrate a lot. They've had to migrate off of their farms. They've been corporatized since the 1980s under Reagan. They've had to migrate when the factories were closed. Can you understand a political decision forcing your family to have to move? So we have got to reach out to that feeling of empathy.
Yeah.
And secondly, I wouldn't even call them migrants. They're war refugees. And
what percentage would you say, though, Rachel? What percentage would you say are war refugees coming from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, which is where the majority of the immigrants are coming from?
I couldn't give a number, but
could you give a guesstimate?
There's political war, there's economic war. I'd say 100%. Okay, well, I lived in a small town in Honduras 3 years. I'm telling you, people like that in villages,
yes,
Central America, South, they don't ever want to leave their towns. There were people that couldn't even fathom going 2 hours to the capital, to Tegucigalpa, on a bus.
Yes.
They're going to pack up and leave their children. Are you kidding me? So I'd say 100%, sir. And one quick story. I was about 10, 15 years ago, I was moving and I needed to go to the local day worker center here, legal place. You get someone to help. And I pulled up to the worker center, and there were, a bunch of, his people around looking for work, but also a couple of white guys there with big American flags. And I knew right away they were Minutemen type guys. That was the Minutemen days. And I get out of my U-Haul and I start walking towards the guys to, get a helper for the day. And a white guy comes up to me with a big flag and he's like, hi, ma'am. I said, hello, sir. And he said, do you understand? I stopped him. I said, excuse me, did you vote for Ronald Reagan in the 1980s? And he went, yes, but what does that have to? I said, it has everything to do.
Yeah.
Because if you voted for Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, you voted for war against these people's country, and they're forced to come here, and now you're going to blame them. So get out of my way. And I went and I got my guys, and I went and I moved my house, and when I came back, like 7-8 hours later, no one was there except for one older gentleman, a Hispanic gentleman. And he came up to me, and if you know humble people, this is amazing that he even approached me. And he came up and he says, hey, I was here earlier today when you picked up those men and you talked to that man. He said, you were absolutely right. Thank you for standing up. So we can never shut up. We can never feel that these people don't need to be shamed into being human.
Yeah. Well, listen, I say if we clean our own house first, we wouldn't worry about having to clean other people's houses. But that's where the problem lies from what we do over there. Let's get back to Daniel Ortega real quick, because we had in the 90s, we had the conservative government, and then 2006, a reinvented Daniel Ortega comes back into the political spectrum. He is then elected in a landslide, over 60% of the vote. And now we've seen peace in Nicaragua through the 90s and through the year 2000 into 2000, 2006. Daniel Ortega, in fact, is one of the only leaders that's doing business with both Russia and once enemy America, whatnot. Can you unpack the last several 12 years under Daniel Ortega and where the country has gone? Because I also heard something that now 1/3 of the indigenous people own land in Nicaragua, and they're being pulled out of poverty since his presidential election in 2006. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, so that's why, when and the other day, and it was so disappointing, and I know I felt like I was watching deer in headlights a bit when I was watching the Democracy Now! Interview the other day, because this one guy talking about, well, the opposition is made up of former Sandinistas and peasants and women. I thought, I don't buy it.
No.
Not one landless peasant who's been given land is ever going to go against the person that gave them land. So there's that's nonsense. I smell a rat, definitely. Nicaragua, I've been saying, reeks of Venezuela. And so so what you've had is an incredible transformation. I mean, imagine if the United States can do business with Nicaragua, then they're not talking revolutionary, communist, violent. They're already in power, and they came to power, legally and through elections.
But Daniel Ortega does have a socialist type of government. He was reinvented, correct? There's universal Medicare, there's education. Go ahead.
No, okay, so I'm getting that. So absolutely, and he was voted in. And so, but what I'm saying is that some of the protests today, they're saying. And this just doesn't ring true. They're saying that he's not socialist enough, and it's like, really? In today's world, even Cuba, they're changing their constitution to legalize private property. I mean, my God. So you have to compromise, but definitely what's been happening, there's new roads, electricity, water, there's worker-owned co-ops. The women who have been brought in. And
peace, too, right? Peace, very important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Women who have been brought into the government, into the economic life.
I've heard that, too.
Top 4 countries in the whole world for gender equity.
Yes.
I'm telling you, know anything about Latin America, that's huge. That's not like gender pay equity in America, where we're, pretty darn equal. We're talking about an entire class of human beings liberated. So none of them is going back, and I don't buy the nonsense that they're part of the uprisings. Sure, the rich pay more taxes, but there's free college for everybody from that. There's school lunch for the poor. Every child, when they graduate from high school, gets $500. There's free health care. They've been building homes for the poor people. I mean, please.
Yeah.
Chomsky is just going, I told you so. Power of a good example.
Well, let me Well, let me dive into something else right now, because I want to be fair on all ends and whatnot, because we've even talked, and you say it's not always black and white. Now, immediately when I saw this stuff going on, I did some digging, and I came up with, there goes that country again, America, butting their nose in. The Center for International Development has given the Ortega opposition $91 million since 2014 to go against and fight Ortega. Now, I have a couple questions there. Number one, who is the International Development, the Agency for International Development? Is that Congress, or is that more like a CIA group? Does Congress know what's going on? And in 2014, did Barack Obama know what was going on, that we were funding the opposition once again for American interests?
Well, okay, Barack Obama was a moron on Latin America. I said so publicly after the Honduran coup, and we'll talk about Honduras another time. The IAD is the International Aid to Development, is part of this kind of neoliberal conglomeration of people who are and groups that are supposed to help develop other countries. But you introduced me as an environmental engineer. I've been working in international development, mostly in Latin America, for decades, and working with a lot of people. And they who work in that do not believe in the IAD, right? It's just.
Do they get approval from Congress to get this money, the IAD? I mean, this is taxpayer money. The first thing I said is, can't we use the $91 million in Flint? What about Puerto Rico?
Well, exactly. This is taxpayer money, and interesting you say that. I'm just in a little Facebook tete-a-tete with someone right now saying, we need to be using our tax dollars here and not for all this stuff. And it's like, exactly.
Yes. Tell a Trump supporter that. I mean, we're using our taxpayer money to cause a problem that's going to cause a serious immigration problem, and then we got to pay for it on both ends. Why don't they call Donald Trump on his word when he campaigned as a non-interventionist and say, stop, get out of the affairs, let Nicaragua handle this themselves?
Okay, so a couple things. One is when Trump had his interview with Putin and everyone's freaking out. I said, okay, let's challenge. So you're now this global peacemaker. North Korea, Russia, let's challenge you. Try Latin America.
Yeah.
And of course, he's not going to do it. So
no way.
You know the hypocrisy.
Yes.
But at least it's a challenge, and it opens people's mind to like, hey, maybe, so you got to challenge. So number two, and we were talking yesterday and we were setting up this interview, the true danger, Pasta, because it's so sad. Americans will never truly care, maybe until it's too late, about other people in other countries. But please, and tell the red states this, is that the real danger is for us. Because this is a model of government, a model of economics, and a model of politics and military intervention that's going to come back to us. They practice on other countries. They practice the neoliberal model first in Chile with the coup in 1973 and the putting in of the most right-wing privatization systems in the whole world, and then they used it like a guinea pig. And so we'll always have to look at what we're doing with other countries, not as though that's something else. They're practicing to come back to us. So watch it, Red State.
Well, isn't it... Rachel, I mean, I understand it's a practice, what you're saying too, but isn't there also just a lot of economic reasons tied to it, whatnot? I read that somewhere in Honduras that we turned into a one-crop state, and I was about to go on a banana, what do you call that? Not eat bananas. Like, I was going to protest bananas because I thought we had turned Honduras into a one-crop state for our own business interest. What does Nicaragua have that the oligarchs want that they can get their hands of if we put in the right government to aid them?
Freedom.
Is it just about freedom? Is there any natural resources there? Is it about gas? Is it about oil? Is it just about...
No, it's not as much as like the banana republics of Honduras and Guatemala. You know, they have the Lake Nicaragua, which is one of the big contentions in the 1920s, is they wanted to build a canal.
Yeah.
You know, so for 100 years, they've had a little country down there that's kind of challenging the U.S. world order for the last 100 years. So when I say freedom, that's really what I mean. They want to shut them up. And I'll tell you, when I lived in Honduras, it's so cute. All the Central American countries have like a thought about what the other countries are like. And the Hondurans always said that the Nicaraguan people are the most rebellious. And so, yes, it's the way to shut down a rebellious people.
Okay. Well, listen, we're running out of time, so let's just dive into another part of this protests that are going on. The protesters today.
Before we go to can I show this picture? This is from Paul Conrad, 1990. And these are little crosses, and they're all made to make the face of Ronald Reagan. And it says at the bottom, Ronald Reagan's legacy to the people of Nicaragua. So
yeah,
it's been going on for a long time.
For a long, long time. Okay, let's talk about the protest today. In all fairness, let's play devil's advocate, because you see the $91 million, you see the aid, you see the blueprint of what we've done in Latin America, putting in our own governments through coups and oligarchs so they can rule, and you can see them, hey, maybe Ortega's went out of favor within the United States government. But let's talk about the protest itself. A lot of these protesters are young protesters. They're kids in colleges, whatnot. From what I understand, Daniel Ortega did raise their taxes while cutting their benefits. Are there legitimate reasons and merit for some of these protests that are going on throughout Nicaragua?
Well, okay. First of all, so a group of those students came a couple of months ago to the United States, paid for by the Freedom House, which is a Ronald Reagan created right-wing think tank, NGO. And they met with some of the most right-wing members of Congress, Marco Rubio, the Cuban Americans in Congress. And so, you know, I see with a little suspicion those, if you ever come and side with those people, you're going to be suspicious in my eyes.
Yeah.
Secondly, yes, you know, students can protest. That's fine. And, you know, when the protests started and they sort of were peaceful, Ortega, you know, didn't do anything about it. It's when they became violent that you had to start, you know, stopping that. And I'd say that it's really a specious argument to say that these were nonviolent protests, because look at the arms they're using.
Yeah.
Look at the training they have. How is this possible?
Yeah.
And you know, and the big uprisings, or you know, protests that started on April 16th were because of Ortega's proposal for modest Social Security reforms. And what he was proposing was a 1% rise in worker contributions to Social Security and 3.5% rise in employers' contributions over time. So, you know, university students don't really think about, you know, Social Security, but, you know, it was going to be coming out of some of their earnings. But again, The NED, you mentioned the IAD, the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, has recently, I think they had to take it down because it was inflammatory, but they said, they've been sowing the seeds of insurrection in Nicaragua for years. So they've been planting all these kind of quote unquote civil society NGOs around Nicaragua, paying them with our tax dollars. And then all of a sudden they look for a moment, a chispa, as you say in Spanish, which is a spark, and then they're there ready to go. And so I want to say is, I think some of the confusion with people on the left is you're trying to look at, you're trying to look for this coup to look like past coups. Well, it doesn't look like Allende. They're not bombing the palace. Can't be a coup. Well, just like we shouldn't be studying past wars, trying to figure out future and current wars, we shouldn't be looking at past coups. This is a whole new way. It's called the soft coup. It happened in Uruguay. It happened in Brazil. It's happening all over. And so this is one more example of it.
It's just one of those ultimate schemes to make it look like there's unrest within the people inside the country in the American eye, so we can then later go on and prop up these coups even more. Rachel Bruhnke.
And one quick thing, Ortega, and you got to look at a couple of days ago, they had the 39th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, and I'm thinking of going down there for the 40th. That's going to be a good one. Next July. And anyway, he said, when they protested so much against the Social Security reforms, he says, I took it out. I said, okay, and let's dialogue. He says, but then I realized they didn't want to dialogue. He went to the bishops. They didn't want to dialogue. The Pope, who's just so wonderful, he even called those bishops to task, and, he's trying to rein them in. But imagine America, if Donald Trump, did one of his egregious things he did, then we all rose up and protested, and he says, okay, I hear you. I'm not going to do that. Let's dialogue. That would be amazing. And we might want a dialogue, but of course the man doesn't do that. But here you have a president that's willing to do that, has a whole campaign for peace and dialogue in the country. Sure, there's going to be a disagreement, but it's very important, and the left needs to understand this. You got to choose a side, and then you stick with the side. It doesn't mean everything they do is fine or whatever, but you can't keep switching sides and not understanding the class consciousness of you got to stick with the people who are trying to develop humane, sustainable lives on this planet. There's two sides, and that's it.
I hear you, Rachel Bruhnke. And it looks like Daniel Ortega has been on the positive side of that coin, and it sure smells like American intervention here, up to no good for not the right reasons. Rachel Bruhnke, I want to thank you for joining us today. We'll have more conversations about Latin America throughout the coming weeks, and maybe next July we can go to the Sandinistas' 40th anniversary together.
All right.
Thank you, Rachel Bruhnke. I'm Pasta Jardula. This has been a Convo Couch exclusive. We'll see you soon.